fly a plane safely, what safety regulations ought to be in place in order to operate safely in a factory, or simply what kind of ISO or international standards you need to have in order to ensure that work is conducted fluidly across all different computing devices, you'd not think of yourself necessarily as a neuroscientist or a psychologist, but you think of yourself as someone who's interested in human factors or ergonomics, for example. But like the fine tradition of the past, we're hoping to essentially blur this boundary. And why is that so? Well, most of us have heard of, for example, automated driving. Now, if we're going to be automating technology, what is there with regards to performance to be measuring? We might see a future whereby the only means by which we can actually be measuring human factors or the risks therein, we might only be able to measure it through physiological activity or activity of the nervous system. And hence, there might be this need, indeed, for us to start measuring this activity and to start making inferences with regards to human performance, human safety, human satisfaction within such contexts. Now, those of you who are familiar with the state of automated driving might be familiar with this SAE levels set by the Society of Automotive Engineers. And given that they're engineers, they're very familiar with the regulations of driving, allowing them to come up with such levels of, well, here we have SAE level 0, whereby there's no automation, to where there's full automation, and here is what the human driver is supposed to do across these different levels of automation. Now, that's all fine and proper, unless you're a psychologist or a neuroscientist or a human factors expert. Because essentially, what you'd realize with SAE level 2, with partial automation, is that you're instructing the user to keep their eyes on the road and to keep their hands on the wheel, and try to do nothing for as long as possible, whilst presenting them with a really tempting big screen at the side to be doing all sorts of other stuff, right? So many of us would be immediately aware of the kind of risk that such a situation poses to the mind-wandering brain. So it's unsurprising to many of us that accidents and incidents can happen, which might not be anticipated by those responsible for setting the rules for operations. Now, motivated by that, we're very lucky to be supported by our friends. For example, in Frontiers in Neuroeconomics, we've recently launched a journal, not by the conference per se, but by the community, whereby we try to push forward the vision set by Raja Parasuraman in 2003, where he said that investigations of the neural basis of mental functions and physical performance ought to be done in relation to technology, work, leisure, transportation, healthcare, and other settings in the real world. There are 7 sections to this newly established journal, as indicated there, all being fueled and prospering from the different contributions from all the different fields, not just in neuroscience or in psychology, but also in engineering methods for better neuroimaging and human factors and ergonomics. And we're really looking forward to this opportunity whereby all these different contributions can come together to give birth to or make contributions to these 7 sections. And who knows, perhaps we need far more sections than these mere 7. Now, I'm very pleased and honored to share that the 3rd Neuroeconomics Conference for 2021, which will take place in September, has a lot to offer you. If you'd like to participate, first and foremost, these are just a snapshot of some of the tutorials and workshops that we've already set up, that we've gotten the commitments for. And they're actually, I should have added a couple of extra dots over there, because we actually have many more offers for tutorials and workshops. And I'm hoping to hear from you as well if you have something to offer the community, but we're hoping to bring everyone together to learn from one another. We have some fantastic keynotes, for example, by Professor Slater in VR, Professor Levy in the area of automated driving and inattentional deafness, Professor Rizzo on the implications of aging and the risks that it brings towards, for example, vehicle operations, and Professor Bevelier, who will talk about games and what they might mean with regards to vocation and selection. We have a fantastic panel of plenary talks ranging from topics related to social robotics, to consumer neuroeconomics, to brain-computer interfaces, the use of genetic algorithms for determining or modeling human cognition, the use of games and VR in training individuals, transcranial direct stimulation, exoskeletons, and clinical applications, and lots more. We've already have an ongoing passive BCI hackathon, which I encourage you to take a look at, not least of all, and perhaps quite crassly, because there's prize money involved. And this is led by Raphael Roy and Fabian Lotte, whereby you could stand to win a prize very kindly sponsored by our sponsors by participating in this passive BCI hackathon. And of course, we have arranged a panel of women in neuroeconomics, and we're really honored to have both Ranjana and Carol, who are actually here with us today, who are also referred to, at least by some of us, as the HFES Women of the Year. They will coordinate and organize a panel to talk about the challenges that females might face in the area of neuroeconomics and how we could make that a more inclusive space for everyone. And last but not least, we will have a panel on ethics, AI, and neuroergonomics led by Ricardo Chavarriaga. So the submission deadline is actually tomorrow, but I assume that many of you have already been aware of the possibility to be submitting an extended abstract, and there is still time, right? So we look forward to receiving your submissions for presentation at the conference itself. And I'd like to end by saying a word of thanks to all of our many sponsors. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over the mic to Klaus.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lewis, for this introduction, and thank you very much for organizing this, setting everything up again. This is very fruitful over the last 4 webinars already. So welcome everyone to the 4th webinar of Neuroeconomics. We are going to talk about the frontiers in cognitive neuroeconomics special section today. And let me switch to my presentation mode. So I hope you can all see my screen. I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to this section of Frontiers in Cognitive Neuroeconomics, which is one of the journals that Louis just mentioned that was just launched under the family of Frontiers in Neuroeconomics. And I'm going to present you with the ideas with the editorial board actually, and what we identified as the grand challenges for the field of cognitive neuroeconomics, to then basically hand over to 4 excellent speakers. I'm very much looking forward to 4 great talks today from the editorial board, all members that will also be present at the Neuroeconomics conference that Louis just mentioned. So, and I hope that you will all submit your contributions that we will meet again then back in September. Okay, so we are talking about the Frontiers in Neuroeconomics section, Cognitive Neuroeconomics. This is one of the 7 sections. I have the pleasure to be the specialty chief editor, and we have an excellent board of associate editors for this journal. We have Carol Baldwin, Martin Bleichner, Louis Chuang, Stefan Debner, Camille Genet, Ryan McKendrick, Ranjana Mehta, Norman Nasser, Raphael Roy, Giovanni Vecchiato, and Edmund Wascher. And 4 of the editors are present today and will present their work and expertise to you. So why do we have a section on cognitive neuroeconomics actually? And what is cognitive neuroeconomics? Neuroeconomics, as defined by Raja Parasuraman 2003, as Louis already mentioned, is the brain at work in an everyday life. So neuroeconomics aims at understanding human brain function underlying human interaction with technical systems during work and leisure. And the term cognition here is used to describe a wide range of processes or functions, among others, attention, memory, decision-making, many, many more. All these that are relevant to human technology interaction. So if you bring together both terms, obviously, then cognitive neuroeconomics can be defined as the section of neuroeconomics that is concerned with the investigation of the neural basis of these cognitive processes involved in the user's interaction with a technical system at work or during everyday life. This is still a very broad definition of the field, and it is a broad field, but I think there are 2 points that are worth mentioning. First is that cognitive neuroergonomics uses insights from analyzing neural dynamics in ergonomic settings. So this is the place of investigation that we're talking about, that is the interaction with technical systems. But we use that to inform cognitive theory first. So we basically transfer our insights back to inform cognitive models and cognitive theory. And second, we also do the same basically with regards to a better understanding of human brain function. So this is a field that has like several directions, and we inform different areas that we use and utilize basically to drive the investigations in the field of cognitive neuroeconomics. So I think this is important to know that this goes in many directions, and not only that we're using these methods to drive cognitive neuroeconomics as a field. And if you talk about cognitive neuroeconomics as a field, then there will be challenges in the coming decades. We already faced a lot of challenges over the last decades, and the editorial team and us, or members of the editorial team and me, basically put together our ideas of what the main challenges will be. You can find this in this Grand Field Challenge paper on cognitive neuroergonomics and frontiers. It's open access. And if you're interested in that, please feel free to read the paper. I'm going to give a super brief introduction to the 4 main challenges that we basically identified. The first challenge is that the future in cognitive neuroergonomics will have to bridge levels in research in the field of cognitive neuroeconomics. If I talk about levels of research, we're talking about basic, translational, and applied research in neuroeconomics. So as we all know, fundamental research is mostly addressed in controlled, highly controlled lab environments that is then later translated to work environments. That would be the translational aspect. And this translational research then often uses expensive high fidelity simulations for improved realism. That is expensive. There's often restricted access to these facilities, but they enable controlled repetition of realistic scenarios. So you gain sufficient statistical power with a sufficient level of realism to still become more ecologically valid, but remain or have statistical power. And then in the end, and this is what Raja Parasuraman also wanted to push here, is that this research should also take place in the real world. It's applied research where we investigate the brain dynamics, the cognitive functions in real world settings while humans interact with technical systems. And here we have less control or no control about confounding factors, but we have high ecological validity. Actually, this is the highest ecological validity we can get, because the lab is the real world here. So, and if you look at the x-axis here, you have experimental control, and you could add internal validity to this axis. And on the y-axis, you have the ecological validity. And so on the right side down here in the right corner, we have fundamental research with high control, high internal validity that then basically is reduced. Control is less and less, and internal validity is reduced when it comes to translational cognitive neuroeconomics, and then in the end applied cognitive neuroeconomics. At the same time, the ecological validity increases significantly. And we as a group identified virtual reality and new mobile brain body imaging technologies to basically bridge these gaps. VR, while still in its infancy, already provides a relatively high level of realism, a lot of problems, obviously, but might in the future be the low-cost method to bridge fundamental cognitive neuroeconomics and applied neuroeconomics, and to get all these different levels of research in cognitive neuroeconomics better together. This is one of the ideas and insights that we have in the paper. And 2 of these factors here, virtual reality and especially mobile brain body imaging technologies, are key factors that lead us to the second challenge. And that is that we need better mobile imaging methods to investigate embodied cognitive neuroergonomics. If you look at the majority of workplaces or even interactions with technical systems during leisure, you see that participants or humans are actively behaving. They are interacting with technical systems. I hope you can see the video, not the way I do, but you get the idea about this assembly plant here. There's lots of movement involved. There's lots of attention and motor control involved in interacting with these technical systems. So if we want to understand how the brain realizes all these complex cognitive and motor functions while we interact with the technical system, we need mobile imaging methods. So the majority of workplaces, as I said, requires active behavior, even if it is only head and eye movements and manual control of the system. But these motor actions influence cognition and obviously the accompanying brain dynamics, because any movement will lead to sensory feedback that is processed by the brain and by definition will change brain dynamics that we measure. It is thus imperative to understand cognition during interaction. And action here is like the bold term with the technical system. So this requires new approaches that are now available for cognitive neuroergonomics research. Martin Bleichner will talk about this in a few minutes. So the results, however, of these new imaging approaches, investigating human brain dynamics in actively behaving participants, will have to be compared against established study results coming from the labs, highly controlled setups, stationary setups, because the parameters might differ. We will be confronted with different outcomes in these studies, and we have to link them, coming back to the first challenge of bridging the different levels of neuroeconomics research. And at the same time, getting us to the third challenge that we identified, and that will be how can we generalize from physiological parameters that support specific cognitive processes on all these different levels of research. New results from fundamentally to applied, from stationary to mobile experiments have to be embedded in a theoretical framework to enhance knowledge, actually. We increase the amount of information every single day. The amount of papers being published every single day is more than we can cover as an individual. But it is time that we systematically create knowledge and not just accumulate information by integrating these parameters, indicators potentially even, that are disconnected from existing theories if we do not embed that in existing theories, models, and do standard falsifiable model research. This requires systematic cooperation of physiological, this requires systematic comparison, obviously, of physiological parameters across tasks and methods. And this integration has to be based on falsifiable models. Going back to research that works with theories and models where we try to falsify our assumptions and not confirm our models. And we can use different and new approaches, big data, and other analytical approaches and cross-lab collaborations to really foster new insights into the field rather than producing more and more information that is disconnected with existing knowledge. And I think the fourth challenge that we identified is one of the keys to do that, and that is that we need to work with open access to data, to protocols, in neuroergonomics. And open access is generally, as reproducible science, is essential to democratic discourse and the design of human-centered technologies. It is pivotal that we have data to access, to prove concepts, to basically falsify others' works if this is not robust science. Scientific practice needs to be reproducible and transparent. And I think one of the best examples that we just have is like the deletion of DNA sequences by the NIH, where we now have no access anymore to the data to really understand how specific virus families might have developed. So publishing experimental protocols, procedures generally, like VR protocols, the standard stimulation that we use in the lab, the data that we collect with these protocols, and how we analyze these data, all these approaches, the code has to be open access free to work for everyone. And this kind of open access is essential for robust science. To achieve this, we should also standardize formats that we use in physiological recordings. There have been several formats over the last years, like BIDS for EEG, but also other imaging modalities that we can use so that we have an easy to share databases for all the labs, all researchers basically to work with this data and to check whether everything is fine and to make better use of the data that is out there. With that, the 4 challenges that we identified, I would like to close and introduce very briefly only the 4 speakers that we have. And you've seen already Carol and Ranjana, who will be on the women's panel at the Neuroeconomics conference. So we will start off with Brian McKendrick, who's going to talk about science engineering, neuroeconomics, use, misuse, disuse, and abuse. And this talk and presentation will be followed by Carol Baldwin, talking about monitoring driver attention and semi-automated vehicles. Then we have the presentation by Martin Bleichner, who's going to talk about long-term ear EEG in the real world. What does it take? And the session will be closed by Ranjana Mehta, who is talking about human exoskeleton interactions, a mind-motor machine investigation. Thank you very much for everyone being here. Thank you much again, Louis, for organizing, and thank you for the presenters. I'm very much looking forward to this talk, to the 4 talks, and I'm going to leave the stage now for Brian to start.
Thank you very much, Klaus. I'll start sharing. Okay, hopefully that's coming through. So I wanted to start and say there are a lot of great talks on the Neuroergonomics YouTube channel that I think are a nice complement to this one, specifically some of the talks detailing levels of cognitive workload, neuroadaptive systems, and reverse inference. I suggest anybody interested in those topics to go listen to those talks. They're very nice, have a lot of good diagrams and kind of describe some of those elements, which I think are a complement to what I'll be talking about. So a lot of what drives this talk is this notion of constantly wanting to improve our practice of neuroeconomics, but at the same time, not letting this strive for a perfect science be an enemy of a good and useful science with a valid tool set. We're always going to be striving for better sensors, better data, better biomarkers, but kind of the question is, when and where does that become useful? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And another thing that's kind of been unique in my experience as a neuroeconomics researcher and practitioner is the pushback, or the context in which there is significant doubt in some of the things that we do. And so what I kind of wanted to start with is, what are some things that we as practitioners can look for and should be talking about and working on to enhance the use of our tool sets, such that we can not just improve the science through laboratory work, but through actual practice of being able to deploy it in the real world and learn from our own use of the technology. The one is ease of use. There is a common conception that a lot of the tools that we deploy require incredible amounts of expertise, huge calibration times, and lengthy tool setup. I think it is important for us, as we both write in our papers and talk to those who we would like to allow us to use this technology to enhance a process, is to make it clear that we do not have to use an extensive setup time or heavy post-data processing. There are many tools, specifically some that I'll talk about later, and those that have been talked about in the neuroadaptive technology community and the BCI community, that allow for real-time processing, very quick setup times, and at times short calibration. As Klaus just mentioned, the need for generalizability. There is an assumption that our tools are incredibly rigid and they work in a very specific context at a very specific time. Can our generalizability be improved? Of course, that's why we just talked about that as a grand challenge. But we need to still be able to talk about where we can generalize and where we have demonstrated generalizability. So it's all about the range of what we can do. One that I've been thinking a lot about, which really fits well with this notion of use, is are our tools diagnostic? The notion is maybe I can't have a perfect representation of an underlying brain state or an underlying kind of emotional state. That is a grand goal. But can I show that a tool that I've developed with a certain amount of validity can be more diagnostic than a previous tool? You know, so a canonical example is, can I build a brain classifier that has more utility than something like a NASA TLX, or more utility than a dual task paradigm where I have to completely change the operating environment to get a valid measure? If I can show sufficient diagnosticity with this tool, is it not valid and useful, even if maybe not perfect? This is another one that I get to experience a lot very personally, which is when you're developing these tools, and this relates to the last one, am I going beyond just what someone could tell me, or just being able to observe someone's behavior? Raja talked about this a lot. We always have to be able to describe how our neurophysiological metrics contribute beyond what can be just seen with behavior, beyond what can be communicated. And within today's world, especially for those of us working in industry or the consumer side, how can our tools be better than just slapping on automation or an AI solution where it can just have infinite amounts of data to try to enhance the process? We need to be thinking about these things and how we create and communicate value when we say, why are our tools valid? Why are they valuable? And how are we contributing to the betterment of society? And then I'll culminate kind of with something that's become really interesting to me and something I've been pushing more, is this notion of transparency. Not only will we have to be able to describe to others the value that we create, but we have to be very careful as we create ever more advanced methods that we actually understand the biomarkers that are involved in the algorithms that we're using to predict brain states, that we understand their limitations, and that those can be communicated to users and stakeholders and other scientists, most specifically. So I want to start with 2016 for me. I was in California and I was walking with a great friend of mine to a donut shop. And I was asking him, or I was musing on the question of, do we really know how statistically good a classification algorithm has to be in order for it to be useful? My assumption was, well, we can make ones that have certain statistical properties, but until we start deploying them in the real world, or somewhat haphazardly, just seeing where they fail or what they do good at, we really have no idea. We don't know if I need so for, in a receiver operating curve, for an algorithm, when it's making classification and predictions, do I need a 90% area under that curve, which is just to say that I have a really excellent model fit? Or can I get away with something lower than that? Can I still have utility on a simpler algorithm? And so that led us to developing a test bed and then creating a labeling schema to kind of look at that. So we created a fairly simple test where you had to remember elements of what identifies an object in memory, and then a unique schema for then saying, well, what is my correct response to that object? And this could actually get incredibly complex as we stacked on rules and we added negations and things like that. And the plot to the lower right shows people's behavior to that. And it for the most part is similar. We have fixed effects, and then the red lines are each individual, but people differ in this. And this is part of a paper that we had published. So and this is kind of the basis for the algorithm that I'll be talking about throughout the rest of the talk, is what's based on this paper. And this predictor of mental workload, and a big driver we found here was how we labeled the data. One of the big insights we had was, if you just labeled the data, when building a classifier based on the context, the pure environmental context, your classifier will not be a good generalizable tool for human cognition. And I'll show some results on that later. Instead, what we did is we took these random effects that I have here on this lower right plot, and we used those as thresholding labels based on individuals when we went back and labeled their data. And what we found was actually quite astonishing. And it was a much better way of creating a generalizable classifier than labeling our data based purely on context. And this kind of relates to something else we wanted to do with the test bed, and it was kind of driven by a conversation I had with Raja at one point during a lab meeting, and we were kind of musing on different things that the science could do and different things that human factors should be looking at. And he asked, do we think there's a paradigm that allows us to actually isolate the effects of attention, both on behavior and brain activity, and memory? Can we actually separate these things? At the time, my thought was probably not. That's probably impossible. But in thinking on it more, I still think that's probably incredibly difficult. But I do think there are ways we can create experimental paradigms that can allow us to better understand the contributions of one versus the other. Oh, I showed this previous testbed environment, which was really driven by memory. How much did I have to hold in memory to correctly identify a stimulus and then produce a correct response? When we had trained this, we also did transfer testing. Namely, we said, well, can I remember the locations of objects and then recall them later? And we did these tests with, in the population that we trained on the main task, and then across with a completely different population of individuals who the classifier had never seen before and on a different task. And then we did this for what we called perception. Basically, we would then reduce the complexity of the rules individuals had to remember, but we would then degrade the visual stimuli, so you couldn't actually distinguish between the different features of the stimulus. And then we compared learning on that to a Gabor patch orientation study. And then we did another one looking at visual attention, essentially, or visual search, where we looked at the competition of features and color and things like that. And then we compared that to a Levy attention task. And so on each of these, we trained within an individual, within a group. How well did we do there? Then we trained on a cross task, and then we trained on a cross task and cross participants to see how well we would generalize. And then we actually even compared how well our algorithms generalized across the main tasks. So we would build an algorithm for memory, how well did it do in our manipulation on perception or our manipulation on intention. And this kind of, so gets back to what I was saying about the ability to do this when you're just looking at kind of the environmental context versus when you're taking into account individual differences in kind of cognitive capacity, kind of building a classifier for cognitive load. So that kind of ogive function that I showed before is what's referred to as a rash model. And the big thing to take away from this table is, so the CV-AUC is basically a measure of model fit within the testing population. How well could an algorithm do? And what we see is that it really didn't matter which labeling technique we did. The rash model was a little bit better, but the standard model of just using the difficulty levels in the task was pretty good. The big difference is the second we took that model and unmodified, looked at completely new individuals who were not part of its original training set. That's when the kind of model fit for the standard way of doing it, just looking at task difficulty, was basically useless. It was just guessing at that point. However, our model that was actually trained on individual differences and was trained to recognize, this person's actually an overload at a level of 7 versus this other person maybe at a level of 4. When it had that additional context, it transferred much better. Not only that, but that same model also showed much better transfer to then the different kind of task that was also taxing memory or attention or perception. I was hoping that we would see a much better kind of disconnect between memory, attention, and perception. But as you can see here, in all honesty, they kind of transfer well across one another. Initially, I thought this was I would have called that a failure in my mind. I was hoping to get much more kind of discrimination. But this is where it kind of gets interesting, and we built these classifiers, and now we wanted to start applying them to novel contexts beyond what they were trained for, see how they behave, see what they kind of do. So one of the things is, we basically turned this into a real-time system. So you put it on, you do a 10-second calibration, and then you start getting workload predictions or cognitive load predictions regarding your memory, your perception, and your attention. So I write a lot of proposals. I wanted to see what my brain looked like during this process. And this is effectively it. This was a dashboard that we had created for seeing in real time what the predictions of this algorithm were. And what was really fascinating is, even though there was good transfer across memory, attention, and perception, as we would observe this algorithm, we noticed that the behavior of these three classifiers was very distinct. Attention was an interesting one, very common. It would show you're kind of near this borderline of overload where you're susceptible to making errors. And this has a lot to do with what we've been seeing, kind of these notions of attention shifting. Tasks that involve a lot of very focused and then shifts of attention kind of keep you right at this borderline of overload, at least based on this classifier. But you can imagine, when I'm writing a proposal, perceptually, I wouldn't be overloaded. I'm just looking at a screen. I have no issue discriminating stimuli. And then the interesting one, again, is memory. Something that I found surprising is, if you read the literature on memory overload or cognitive overload, you get this sense that once you go into overload, you just stay there. It's a place that you're in, at least according to our classifier. And even when you think about it a little more based on behavior, it doesn't work that way. At least not what we're observing is, you pop into an overload state, but your brain adapts. It sheds tasks, it sheds information, and you recalibrate. You may have already made those errors, but your brain is trying to constantly calibrate you from a memory standpoint so that you can continue to keep using it. And that's something that we've been continuing to find is, when we do get these states of overloaded memory, they're brief, but they're powerful. As opposed to attention, where they're sometimes much more prolonged and much more frequent. It's been kind of an interesting observation, and we're still doing a lot more research to understand exactly what that means in other contexts. And I'll show you another one. So we've had the pleasure of kind of replicating our initial kind of two-dimensional environment in a three-dimensional environment with Minecraft, which has been incredibly exciting. And essentially what that's been a part of is, there's a maze, and your job is basically to run through very quickly and find high priority individuals or targets, triage them, which is kind of just hit the block with a pickaxe or something, and then continue to move throughout. And so we had a large testing suite looking at eye tracking, facial recognition, as well as our classifier, which I probably should have mentioned at this point. We've done with FNIRS, which uses basically oxygenated hemoglobin in the prefrontal cortex. If you read the paper that I showed earlier, it goes into a much deeper description of what we're doing. I'm just trying to present everyone with kind of like a cursory go through. But here's an interesting example, once again, kind of showing this. So there's two different individuals that were performing this task while wearing our real-time classifier. And you can see the individual on the right was a bit more skilled, and the individual on the left struggled, and it took them a little bit longer to kind of get up to that skill level. And what we found was fascinating is the individual on the right also showed significantly higher elements of overload, particularly in memory, and which makes sense in this task because there was two kinds of individuals. You had to navigate through this environment, and often you would go to individuals who are blocks that had a high reward, and then you'd have to figure out where you'd been before, which blocks hadn't you visited. And it was really fascinating to see some participants would go through this task, get to the very end, and then they'd have a minute of, oh crap, I don't know where I've been and who I have to find. And often we'd see a spike right there in their memory overload. And it was really fascinating to see that. And these are just some of the anecdotal things that we've been able to see, which are going to lead to future testing by just taking something, saying, look, I think it's good enough. Let's see how it does, and really putting it to use. And it's something I think we need to continue to do more of within our field. Another one, and this was probably my second favorite study of the ones that I'll talk about. we had the opportunity to work with an AI team who was building automated descriptions for SysML models for engineers. And we were actually able to work with that engineering team as well. So we got like a real use of experimental AI and the end users together. And what we did is we said, you know what, we're also then going to create human descriptions of these diagrams from a single human expert. And we basically created a testing environment where we said, okay, look at this SysML diagram, look at this description, make a judgment as to how this architecture functions. And then tell me about how much you trust the person who provided you that description. Would you use it again, etc. While also then monitoring their cognitive load in real time. The fun bit is we lied to them. Deception studies are always awesome and super fun. And I think this notion of kind of like a generalized Turing test is incredibly powerful for us in the neuroergonomics and human factors community. So sometimes when given a human description, we told them that description was written by a machine. And sometimes when given a machine description, we told them it was written by a human. And we wanted to see if these behavioral, self-report, and neurophysiological measures could help me understand whether there was a bias for using human descriptions or machine descriptions. And I thought what we found was incredibly fascinating. So on the bottom right, or in the bottom, you can kind of see here, we have a description that was created by a human, created by a machine, but the engineer was told it was written by a human, created by a human, told it was written by a machine, and or created by a machine. And what was consistent here was that if the kind of human user believed that the description came from a machine, their response accuracy was lower. They reviewed the diagram longer. They seemed to have a lower kind of perception of the quality and the trust in the user. Now, I'll say that the behavioral and self-report measures are not statistically significant. But what was interesting is that the percent of time they spent in an optimal workload state, the inverse here is the time they spent in a negative workload state, was significantly different because of just the amount of data that we're able to sample during this time. So what we found is that the brains of individuals who perceived that they were interacting with a machine were actually working harder cognitively from a memory perspective during this task than if they perceived they were working with a human. So this was an example of using cognitive load cognitive load classifier completely devoid of this kind of task to represent as like a diagnostic tool for observing human bias. Because we knew going into this that the accuracy of both of these descriptions that we provided were equivalent. There was no difference in the accuracy of how well they described them. But we saw a significant bias towards the machine system where humans were essentially not valuing it appropriately, and we were able to see that with a neurophysiological measure. The other one, which we did, was a teaming study. And these are very preliminary results, but I wanted to present them to everyone. Essentially, we took a team of individuals who'd never met before, and we sat them in a room. We said, you're going to essentially decipher this code. You're gonna turn this cipher that we give you into a specific response, and then you have to then do a coordinated response together to effectively escape the escape room. And there were two roles here. There was a subordinate who had to enter in all the responses, and a supervisor who had to make sure that they were doing certain things correctly and check them. So an interesting thing about this is because of this fast-paced nature of this and how there was no room for self-report. You couldn't ask them during the task how things are going. And similarly, because their behaviors were unique between them, it was really hard to measure kind of behavioral differences. So this was a perfect opportunity to kind of look at neurophysiology, to kind of analyze what was going on in the teams to see if there were anything meaningfully different. So we had each team do 10 sessions, and they all had a very fast learning curve. You know, when they first did this task, it took them almost 300 seconds to complete it. And by the time they had done 10 versions of this very complex procedural task, they had essentially almost reduced their time to half. The red lines here, once again, represent random effects. So these are separate models for each of the 9 teams that we looked at. And then what was really interesting was when we plotted their cognitive workload relative to the team's best time. Like I said, we're still looking at this, so these are not statistically significant results, but I think they're incredibly fascinating. So we looked at the cognitive workload, or the percentage of time that someone was in an overloaded state for each individual, both the subordinate and the supervisor. And one of the things that we found that was really interesting is if the supervisor took on more of the brunt of the cognitive workload, the team overall was significantly faster. When the supervisor placed that additional cognitive workload on their subordinate, the team seemed to perform significantly slower. You'll notice that, so that would have been on this plot here, any of the positive values on the x-axis, that's when the subordinate is more overloaded for a percentage of time than the supervisor. The negative values are when the supervisor is taking on the burden. And you can see for the most part, and I'll kind of finish up real quick with one last comment on transparency. Namely, as we build these models, there's kind of like a push to look at deep neural networks and other very advanced statistical techniques. There is some work going on right now that is exploring how do you interpret, explain, or be transparent about those models. Often, though, they are models on top of models on top of models that make huge numbers of assumptions. I'd like to draw everyone's attention as we continue to build things in our field towards what are referred to as sparse models. So some, like an elastic net or a lasso regression, use a norm. We've experimented with those. I think for our field, they have a lot wanting because they don't really handle covariance very well of features. Some more interesting tools, or this is an algorithm referred to as Cindy, which finds sparse regression models in dynamical systems. I'll cite a paper here. I think this is a really fascinating thing to look at, and it's sparse in terms of predictors. So that's kind of our biomarkers. The idea is to find sparse biomarkers when we build these models so that we can actually interpret them. And so we've been exploring a lot of work in what's called grammatical evolution and genetic programming for then finding regression models for doing this. And a lot of it is based on an information criterion. So it's essentially like finding the maximal entropy within a dynamical system and then creating an explicit equation for it that is sparse in the predictors so that we have very interpretable solutions. And I would then recommend any of these papers to individuals who are looking to create interpretable models that are explicit in the biomarkers of why you're seeing the kind of workload that you're seeing. These are some very powerful models that we should be looking at as alternatives to kind of these, while very flexible, often very dense and black box models. And that's my talk. And I want to thank everybody for your time.
Thank you very much, Ryan. This is super dense information, really interesting. There are a few questions. I basically just started posting a few questions in the background. So the question is, I would, if there's like any question on the YouTube channel, Louis, do you have like any access to that? Other than
not at the moment.
So other than that, I suggest that we keep going and have like one large discussion in the end. Okay. Good. Okay, good. Then let's proceed. And who's up next is Carol, right? Yes, please, Carol. The stage is yours. We do have the preview screen now, not the presentation screen.
Sorry. Swap. How's that? Now you see my slides?
That's perfect.
All right. Thanks you. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, thanks a lot, Ryan. I guess I was muted there a minute ago, but very interesting work. And I'm happy to be invited to participate in this this program again this morning here, or morning my time. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit, continue talking about challenges in neuroergonomics, but now kind of more specifically applied to monitoring driver attention systems and semi-automated vehicles. So to give a little bit of a roadmap of what I'll be talking about, I'll talk a little bit about the space and the need for this kind of work. And so levels of driver automation and people's lack of understanding of that, hence the need to monitor whether they're paying attention. They may not even know whether they need to be paying attention, but somehow I think it would be very important if we were able to tell when they're attentive and when they're not. And then a major challenge, bridging the gap from applied research, from laboratory studies to driving simulations to on-road studies at various different levels. And then get back to, I still think that we have theoretical challenges that we need to overcome, we need to address. And I think we're kind of maybe just at the tip of the iceberg of some of that. And humans are messy. We do all kinds of things. There's individual differences. We're intra-individual differences and inter-individual differences. And we're not always doing what researchers are hoping we're doing when we're participating in studies and things like that. And we're all over the place. So I think that continues to be a major challenge. And not to mention, I guess, some of the extremely basic things we have just went through, and we're not completely out of a pandemic. And when it comes to challenges for neuroergonomic research, I know a personal challenge for mine, I switched labs shortly before, switched universities from George Mason to Wichita State, shortly before the pandemic broke out. And I have essentially went through a little over a year where I was not allowed to put electrodes and sensors and things on people. So I think, maybe that goes without saying, but this is not just some survey you can send out to people kind of a thing. It's much more challenging work. But to start out, so talking about the problem space, as I'm sure we're all aware, semi-autonomous driving systems are increasingly pervasive, but they're still misunderstood. So for example, in a real recent study that came out looking at just adaptive cruise control, so that's like if you only had the level 1 driving, which is coming up on the next slide, it's not the regular cruise control. It will literally keep you from running into a car right in front of you. It'll adjust your speed to that car. And people understand it better than they did 10 years ago, but even owners with vehicles equipped with this adaptive cruise control are still not aware of many of the important limitations. And there's been some earlier work that has been real fascinating to suggest even if people are initially aware of some of the limitations of it, they can quickly forget and get into this sense of automation complacency if they don't experience that limitation for a period of time. And I have kind of an anecdotal story about that myself. But I want to talk about these levels of automation before I give that little anecdotal story. So this is the Society of Automotive Engineers, levels of driving automation. I'm going to guess most of us have seen this before. When I talk about semi-automated levels, I'm really talking about level 2 and level 3. Level 2, partial automation. You have lateral and longitudinal lane control. So basically the car can do those basic control tasks of maintaining your speed and your lane position, but the driver's supposed to be paying attention at all times, doing all tactical, strategical maneuvers, monitoring for hazards to the same extent as if they were manually driving. And I'm pretty sure drivers don't even understand this. And even if they do understand this, they're probably not capable of doing that. Level 3 is a slightly higher level. You don't necessarily need to be doing hazard monitoring at all times, but you need to be in a state to resume control within seconds if the system gets outside of its operating parameters. So that's basically what I'm talking about when I just kind of lump these two into semi-automated driving. And I think it's worth pointing out and reminding ourselves that, we've studied driving behavior for quite some time now. And at least one, I think, useful way of looking at dividing the driving task into several different levels goes back to Michon's 1985 thing, where the control is that basic level of lateral and longitudinal control, the kinds of things that an experienced driver can basically do almost automatically. That's what is currently being automated. So level 2 automation, which is currently out on the market, the Tesla Autopilot, the GM Super Cruise, those are only level 2 automation, and all they can do are the things that humans already could almost do automatically anyway. Okay, but now when drivers are engaged in that, we're taking that out, but we're expecting them to continue to do all the more challenging tasks. And this taxonomy has been recently supported in on-road studies with on-road naturalistic studies. So going back a bit, earlier, and I'm going to guess most people have heard of this, the first fatal Tesla crash, there were at least 3 bad assumptions according to the National Transportation Safety Board. One was on the part of the automation, and the automation made the assumption that the tractor trailer that was actually cutting in front of the Tesla vehicle was actually part of the sky. It was white, it was a cloudy day. The automation did not detect that that wasn't just part of the sky. That's obviously not good, but further, the other factors or bad assumptions that NTSB declared were, one, that the driver understood the limits of the automation, that the driver would even understand that there was a possibility that the car might confuse that. And the third big one was that the driver was paying attention. Okay, and paying attention, I'm going to say, is one of our big challenges in these. So in these semi-automated vehicles, particularly level 1 and level 2, to a large extent also in level 3, drivers are expected to stay in the loop. They're expected to be paying attention. But A, do they even understand this? And a lot of our recent work has suggested no, they do not. Our work and other people's work, they don't even understand that. But even if they do understand it, it requires vigilance. And that's something humans are just not good at. Maintaining focused attention on something for a long period of time. Even if it's critical, humans are not good at that. We shift in and out of different internal, external attentional states, focus, default mode network. We shift in and out of this, particularly when there's very little to do and you're just kind of monitoring something, but you're not having to be an active participant. So what can we do about this? That's the problem space. What can we do about this? I'm suggesting that neuroergonomic methods of monitoring attentional state are one very good possibility to address this issue. So how can we tell if drivers are paying attention when they're not actually driving? Well, a challenge in this, and I'm kind of leaping ahead, I hope to come back to that a little bit, leaping ahead, is this idea of, as Klaus already mentioned, this, we need to bridge basic research to translational research. There have been a lot of laboratory studies of attention and vigilance, and usually very simple studies, but to what extent can we take any or much of that research and translate it to driving at all, and then driving behavior at the highest level. So in this driving studies of attention and vigilance, there have been some studies on attention and vigilance in simulator studies. Most of my work, honestly, has been in simulators, almost all of it. And I've used a variety of low and high fidelity simulators, but it's all been driving simulators. As was previously mentioned, this has some benefits. We can have carefully controlled studies. We can make sure unexpected things are a lot less likely to happen, but it's not real world driving. You can ramp that up to on-road test tracks. That gives that, now you're in an actual vehicle on a road, but you're still not on an open road. There have been a few very limited number of studies on this issue, on-road studies on the open road, but with constraints. We're giving you an artificial task to do. We're not letting you do just whatever you want to do. Going down to the naturalistic study, we do all kinds of things in our car. We all know that. We eat, we drink, we listen to music, we check no, we don't do that. We do. We check our phones. We do all these kinds of things. We interact with people. We have conversations with people, both in the vehicle, outside the vehicle. More naturalistic settings, we're doing all kinds of different things. Those mess up our studies. That's a real challenge to this area. So just to really take it back to a real basic level, laboratory studies of vigilance are numerous, and generally people have one very discrete stimuli. Lots of distractor stimuli is coming, but rarely they'll get some critical signal that they're supposed to respond to as quickly as possible. Only one signal. And what we typically get from these laboratory studies is the longer you're engaged in that task, the less likely you are to detect that critical signal. So detection rate goes down. And then very often, even if you do detect that signal, you take longer to respond to it. So your response or reaction time goes up. Typical laboratory vigilance results. What is the signal in naturalistic driving? There may be many potential hazards or critical signals. There may be many simultaneous hazards. So what then is the signal, and how can we determine whether or not a driver is aware of it, particularly if they don't need to respond? If the automation maybe has some of that, but we need to make sure that they need to be monitoring the automation as well as the hazards. How do we even know if they're not responding, whether or not they're still attentive to these potential hazards? I think that's where neuroergonomics can really shed light. We can get some index of what's going on with the driver, even if they're not physically responding to something. They're sitting there monitoring a screen. Okay. But so then, as I've already kind of mentioned, driving simulator work, these are just some of the simulators I've used over the years. The top left one is like a basic desktop simulator. You see lots of studies using that. Used at George Mason, a motion-based simulator, higher fidelity. You kind of feel bumps when you go over it. Still not a real car. Currently at Wichita State, I actually have a real car, but it's obviously not going anywhere. There's screens there in front, so it's stationary, but it is a real car. There's lots of different levels of the simulator fidelity. In our lab, we've also used a variety of physiological measures. My kind of go-to tends to be EEG and ERP. So we've quite often looked at parietal alpha and frontal theta for indexes of workload and attention. We've used some other bandwidths and metrics as well, but those are kind of the go-to ones. P300 ERP for assessing workload. And then occasionally, not all the time, but occasionally in combination with heart rate variability, some eye tracking, pupil diameter, things like that. Each one of these, and I think this is a challenge that it might be slightly out of line here, but each of these measures, these aren't necessarily even the best measures. These are my go-to measures, and these are a lot of work. And these are a lot of work to train new researchers and students in them. And every time you pick up a new metric, you have to learn that new metric. And that's a big challenge too. There's a lot that goes on behind, conducting these studies. So just quickly to talk about a few of the neuroergonomic approaches we've used in my lab, trying to just kind of keep track of my time here. We've looked at a lot of different things. Mental workload is kind of a go-to, and attentional engagement. We've looked at mind wandering, so trying to detect physiologically whether or not whether your mind's on the road. Just because your eyes are on the road doesn't mean your mind is on the road. We've looked at trying to predict ahead of time when people might fail to detect some kind of an automation signal. And then we've scratched the surface at novel attention management approaches. So I'll quickly talk about a couple of these. The mind wandering series has been one of my favorite. It was a lot of fun to do, a lot of work, but a lot of fun. But so even during manual driving, the research suggests that about half the time we're not really paying attention. Our eyes may be on the road, but our mind is not. So we conducted some research to see, hey, could we even detect these periods of time? Could we distinguish between them? Ran a series of different studies in both low fidelity simulators and high fidelity simulators, single day studies, multiple day studies using a variety of different parameters. I won't have time to go into all that, but basically we did have some success. So we found that we could reliably detect when people were mind wandering. They had an increased parietal alpha power and a decreased P300 response to external auditory probes. We had some luck with the heart rate measures. Interbeat interval in particular tended to be longer when a person was mind wandering, and not maybe surprisingly, gaze concentration. So people aren't scanning the roadway, they're looking straight ahead, so their gaze is concentrated. All of these seem to be reliable indicators of mind wandering state. But this was actually during manual driving. So then we began to look at, well, could we do this using partial automation? Could we predict when somebody might? So if we can detect when they're mind wandering, can we do that ahead of time and predict that they're likely to miss some critical signal? We went back to a desktop simulator, really low fidelity simulator with a basic automated lane changing task. And people would see these little arrows suggesting that they needed to change lanes, but they're just monitoring the automation. So they're not, this would be level 2, they're not having to control their speed and they're not having to control their lane position. They're just monitoring the situation. If that arrow became more red, then they were supposed to indicate that they noticed that. And we were looking at, could we predict whether or not they would notice that signal before they actually got it? Could we predict that they might miss that critical signal? So we had them go through a number of different drives on this and had some success at this. We again, pre-stimulus alpha or alpha power, parietal alpha power in particular, did provide us a reliable indicator of whether or not people were likely to miss that upcoming signal, suggesting that perhaps something could be done ahead of time if we know the driver's out of the loop and not paying attention. Heart rate variability had a little bit of predictive power, and so did gaze concentration, but neither one were sufficient on their own. So maybe in the near future, at least in simulated driving, we might have some luck at being able to predict when they're out of the loop and need to maybe possibly be brought back in. But does any of that translate to real world driving? Almost all of these, we're giving them an artificial task to do. They're having this oddball paradigm or some other kind of a cue thing. Does that translate to any kind of actual driving? And in the real world. And I think there's a number of challenges which I'll kind of continue, but we need more effective mental models of driving automation, and we need more robust theoretically based metrics. We've also looked at then this notion of, I'm going to kind of skim through this kind of quickly for the sake of time, but could we predict people learning these systems, and the rate at which they learn them, and distinguish between novice users of the system and then people that had a little more experience, again, with adaptive cruise control and active lane keeping, gave an artificial task, an auditory oddball task, and had some success with this. So when people were engaged with just active cruise control compared to a baseline, we saw a decrease in the P300 response. Interestingly, when they were engaged with two systems, both active cruise control and active lane keeping, we saw even a further reduction in the P300 response, suggesting that more automation was not necessarily easier. They were actually needing to pay even more attention. But again, does any of this translate to more naturalistic conditions? There aren't a lot of studies on road and certainly not naturalistic conditions yet that have used neuroergonomics methods. There are a few. I just briefly chose to highlight a couple. One controlled on-road study used EEG and heart rate variability and things like that. A recent paper by Strayer and colleagues that actually found no difference in arousal or cognitive demands based on EEG metrics or ECG metrics between manual driving and partially automated driving. But some of the challenges, and this is certainly not to criticize their work, it's some really important work, but participants were always told when to engage in the automation. To a very positive thing, they had two age groups, they drove on different roadways, but they performed an artificial task in addition to the naturalistic driving. They had constraints, they weren't allowed to do other things other than the experimental task. And whenever there was any kind of a hazardous situation, they had to stop the data collection so that it didn't mess up they didn't get too many artifacts in the EEG. Some more promising stuff by one of our own, Klaus Grauman and his colleagues. They've done some studies with promising results saying EEG is a possibility. This wasn't actually on the road, and a couple of caveats about that, though. It's promising, but they did note that any movements related to actual driving produced artifacts in the data, and that the EEG cap itself became uncomfortable over time. So we've got a number of challenges. Increased driving automation doesn't always make things easier, and particularly if people are inexperienced. But these challenges, we still need better sensors, we need better brain imaging techniques, we need new methods to translate this lab sim research to naturalistic setting, and we still need theoretical advances. Just to kind of wrap this up, humans are really messy. As I mentioned, they have inter and intra-individual differences. Many factors that we're often not taking into account can affect the data and the people's response, their knowledge and understanding of the system, emotion, their emotional state at the time, and their fatigue state, social interactions or lack thereof can change physiology, and then all of the other tasks we might do, listening to music, all of these things that we do in naturalistic settings can impact the data. This is a really messy slide of just some of the things that we have thought about in some of our current ongoing work, where we're trying to look at using neuroergonomics measures of identifying loss of vigilance. There's many different ways that loss of vigilance could come from. It could come from fatigue, literally falling asleep, or just mind wandering, lots of different things. Humans are messy. Some of our other survey work, which we have been able to continue doing during this pandemic when we couldn't put electrodes on people, we've tried to look at a whole host of predictors that we think people vary on, obviously age and gender, their knowledge of these automatic driving systems, their acceptance of automation, a number of these other things. And we're trying to predict where they get their information, what their understanding of it is. And that's kind of ongoing work as well. Finding some interesting things. Obviously, people vary in their tech savviness and things like that. They often, there's often a mismatch between what they think they know and what they actually know about these systems, but some pretty interesting work. And there's lots of individual differences that we've identified in this.
Carol, can I ask you please to come to an? Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so let me just skip this slide. And in conclusion, we need a better understanding of driving automation and the limitations, how that impacts people, new metrics, equipment, and theoretical challenges. How do we measure this? And is it the same for everybody? And I will stop at that. Thanks for your attention.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Carol. Again, very nice talk. I have lots of questions, and we just collect and gather all the questions for the end final discussion round. And we proceed with Martin Gleichner. And Martin is going to talk about in long-term EEG in the real world. And maybe that is the nice bridge from the question you asked, Carol, of whether EEG might be a system actually that can be used in real driving in the real world. So maybe get some insights from Martin.
Yes, thank you very much. I will talk a lot about the issues that have been raised. So hi, I'm going to tell you about long-term ear EEG, why it is cool, and what it takes to study the brain activity in daily life. So we are all here because we are interested in how the brain works. We study brains to learn something about ourselves. And unlike introspection or observation of behavior, we can use EEG to examine the workings of the brain that are otherwise hidden from view. Moreover, unlike invasive methods or lesion studies, we can use them to observe what the healthy brain does. We have come a long way from the first recordings of Hans Berger, and today EEG is widely used for scientific, diagnostic, and therapeutic purposes. Yet, most of what we have learned about the brain using EEG, as we have heard, we have learned in the lab. We have learned it from weird subjects in basic experiments. So weird subjects is a term coined in a paper or by Heinrich et al., the weirdest people in the world. In this paper, they point out that most studies conducted in psychology is conducted in participants that are undergrad psychology students, Western students, highly educated, that live in rich and democratic societies. And relative to the global population, this is just a minority. So our results may be highly skewed and generalized poorly to the population as a whole. Moreover, in any imaging study, including EEG, we skew the data in another way, as we already have heard. And the imaging studies we conduct are very brief, rarely exceed 2 hours. We conduct the studies in artificial environments while the participant is stationary, isolated without any social interaction, as we have also just heard, and highly controlled in what she sees or hears or is allowed to do. So both regarding the diversity of people and the diversity of situations, we have just sampled from a fraction of human experience. With mobile EEG now, we have a wider perspective. In recent years, we have seen a great shift in neuroscience. We have overcome many of the constraints I just mentioned. Now we study freely moving people in complex virtual environments during social interactions and even during outdoor experiments. In Oldenburg, we have contributed to this development by working on making mobile EEG transparent. The idea behind transparency is that both the wearer and other people can forget about the hardware. So we started with hiding electrodes in a baseball cap and in and around the ears, and later developed the secret, an electrode array that is worn around the ears. We combine the ear electrodes with a mobile EEG amplifier, a smartphone for data acquisition and stimulus recording, and for data acquisition and stimulus presentation, and in this case, a neck speaker that allows us to present sounds to the participants without the need to cover the ears using headphones. So you can hear everything around you as well as the experimental stimuli. And we use this kind of setup, for example, to study people during their office day. For an example, we conducted recently a study on auditory perception while people were working in their typical office environment for more than 6 hours. People were free to choose what they were doing, working on the computers, talking to people, going for lunch. And from time to time, we presented a sound, and people had to react by pressing the display of the telephone that was strapped around the upper arm. And we found that we can use this setup to study sound perception in daily life and compute the ERPs that we need for this. However, whenever we argue that transparency is necessary, people say, sure, but why limit yourself to so few electrodes? Actually, you can walk around with a high-density EEG setup in Berlin just fine and no one bats an eye. That is certainly true, but transparency is more than other people not caring how you look. It is also that the wearer can forget about it and thereby behave as naturally as possible. Ultimately, transparency is a prerequisite for what I would call ubiquitous EEG. An EEG that is always there, an EEG that is small enough and comfortable enough to be worn for hours on end, but also an EEG that is of sufficient quality with a sufficient number of electrodes so that we can still interpret the signals we are recording. The crucial point of transparent and ubiquitous EEG is that you not only can step out of the lab, but you can also step out of the experiment and study EEG in everyday life for extended periods of time, undisturbed by any hardware. Just like a smartphone camera or the neurophysiological equivalent of a dash cam, an EEG that is always there and can thereby capture all those things we may never encounter during a controlled experiment, either because they are very rare or just don't happen in this context, or because they unfold on longer timescale. But I think if we have this, the possibilities for this approach are astronomical. Therefore, let me give you an analogy from astronomy, actually. So we used telescope to study the night sky. And by doing so, we learned about the stars in our immediate vicinity. Some years back, they then pointed Hubble Space Telescope to one dark spot on the skies. With the standard telescope, there was not much to see there. It was basically a black part of the sky. And then they produced an ultra-long exposure picture by pointing the telescope onto the same spot for days on end. And what they uncovered with this picture was a very deep look back into space and time, revealing structures that they had not seen before. So now, like ubiquitous EEG or transparent EEG provides us with the tools for long-term exposure of human brain activity, so that we can gather new information about the brain by looking at it for a longer time. For this, high-density cap EEG is probably not the optimal approach. And just like the deep field picture was not a trivial task, after all, the telescope is not standing still while these pictures are made, mobile EEG in everyday life is not a trivial task either, as we have already heard. So if you now think, great, I just grab a mobile EEG and get going, I would say not so fast. EEG remains a tricky business. And despite the fact that you have a device that says that it's recording EEG, so the electrical activity of the encephalon, it is more than just that, especially when you move around. We have to be aware that the signals that we record with electrodes on the scalp are a mixture of many different sources. First, we have the brain activity we are interested in, but to a much larger extent, the brain activity we are not interested in, and which we might consider as noise. In an uncontrolled experiment, we have to deal with a much larger variability in this unwanted brain signal. Next, we have the contribution of different physiological non-brain signals, signal changes that you see when people move their eyes, tense their muscle, or simply the activity of the heart. When you allow people to move around without any limitations, these signal contributions are much larger than what you normally would have in the lab. And we have to find ways how to deal with them. Finally, we have technical signal contributions or noise. So the amplifier itself produces noise. And if you bring electrodes close to each other, as it is the case for in-ear EEG or also around-ear EEG, the amplitudes can become so small and the noise of the amplifier produces then a much larger signal than what you are interested in. Another source of noise is the interface between the electrodes and the skin. When you move around, also the electrodes can move around and lead to a further artifact in your data. So all these factors contribute to your recorded EEG signal, and we need to disentangle the brain signal of interest from all these other signals. And this is also the reason why classical EEG experiments look the way they do. You sit in a quiet room, you're instructed to sit as quietly as possible, not to blink, and to attentively react to the same stimulus again and again. And all this is done to assure that you record primarily the neural activity you're interested in, while keeping the influence of those other factors to a minimum, and thereby boosting your signal-to-noise ratio for this very tiny signal. So if we want to record meaningful brain activity in everyday life, we have to take special care. We have to use what we know about EEG, and we have to take what we have learned in the lab and bring it to the streets. When we step out of the lab and into real life, we do not simply take the EEG for a walk. We change multiple factors at the same time, and from an experimental point of view, this is always a difficult move. And I would say that there are three main transitions we have to be aware of when leaving the lab behind. First, we change from a stationary to a mobile setting. We allow people to move, to walk, to look around, to talk. That is, the influence of motion artifacts, as we discussed already at length, become much more substantial. We need to find ways to deal with these artifacts. Second, we cannot use the same experiments as in the lab. In the most extreme, we trade full experimental control to no experimental control at all. So how can we conduct studies in these cases? Last, suppose you go truly mobile, record EEG for an entire day with natural behavior. In that case, we are bound to have a limited number of sensors, be it the EEG channels or other physiological markers. We have to learn how to optimally use these lower number of sensors, where to place them, and how to combine their signals optimally to record the signal of interest and disentangle it from the other signal contributions that are not of interest. When we leave the lab, we have to deal with a wide variety of motion artifacts of different movements. People move their eyes, their face muscles while speaking or eating. They move their head, the neck, the shoulders, and their torso and walk around. All these movements can occur isolated or in all kinds of different combinations. There's been a lot of work going into the detection of walking artifact for mobile brain image, body imaging. However, the average American moves, I think, 3,000 steps per day. So motion is movement, walking is often not really happening. So we have to identify how they identify these artifacts, and we have to learn how to remove the signal so that we do not mistake the brain activity we're actually interested for an artifact or the other way around. In the office study I briefly mentioned at the beginning, we also used the gyroscope to measure gross body movement. So we measured how often or how much people were walking around during the office day and compared it to the situation in which we asked them to sit as still as possible. And what you see here in this figure is the motion profile of 7 participants. And the light brown color indicates periods in which people did not move significantly more than while being instructed to sit still. So the majority of the time, people sit in their office rather quietly in front of their computers. So walking is just not happening that much in these scenarios. So what we need to focus on, I think, is artifacts originating from face or head movements, from neck muscles when we tense up, when we get stressed, and so on. Furthermore, the second transition is in the lab, we have full control about everything, as we already have heard. The lighting, the stimuli we present, exactly what we want and when we want to do it. We have perfect timing control about everything. And this is extremely important for many studies, especially if you do ERP studies. We need this information to interpret the EEG signal. And if you leave the lab, you do not control anymore what the participant sees or hear, nor, and you simply cannot control this. The virtual environment might be a step in between, but in the real world, we will be left with no control. Importantly, in the lab, we also have full control about the participant. In a lab experiments, we tell participants to do exactly what we want them to do. And if participants do not comply with our instructions, we are happy to exclude them and say, yeah, well, he did not get the task. But in real life, we don't have this level of control over our participants. They're going to do lots of different things like eating while driving, and we will not always know what they're up to. So we have to learn how to deal with these factors. Nevertheless, when you record in everyday life, you still need something to relate your EEG to. And I see currently two approaches we can follow there. First, you can take your experiment into the world. This is the approach that is currently done most often, and the approach we have also chosen for our office studies. We use the smartphone to present sounds to the participant and record mobile EEG and the event trigger for each sound we present on the smartphone. This allows us to relate the presentation of each sound to the corresponding segment of EEG and compute the average brain response to these sounds. Well, this approach works fine, but we lack important information. In this approach, we do not know what else happened around the participants. Were there additional sounds? Could the participants hear the sounds we were presenting, or was there too much background noise at any given moment, and so on? The second approach is to make the world your experiment and to study how the brain reacts to whatever it encounters. This is a bit more complicated. To interpret your EEG signal in a meaningful way, we have to know what was going on in the world while we were recording EEG. So you have to bring the world into your EEG. However, world's large, so we have to decide which part of the world we are going to capture together with the EEG signal. We have developed several Android apps that allow us to at least capture sound. So to decompose the sound into different audio features and to store it together with the EEG in a time-synchronized manner using the lab streaming layer framework. With this, we can record the soundscape a person is experiencing and receive trigger for each new sound and use this trigger information for segmenting the EEG signal. This setup then allows us, for example, to evaluate the ERPs in response to naturally occurring sounds in an office space. And below you can see the single subject ERP response to office sounds, on the left side ERPs in response to soft sounds as determined using the RMS value of our app. And on the right side, you see an ERP response to loud sounds. So we can see that we can get meaningful ERPs to different kinds of natural sounds occurring in natural situations. So we can use this setup to study sound, study event-related potentials, and study it in relation to all sounds we encounter while moving around in everyday life. The last transition is from high density to sparse sampling. In the lab, we are used to have as many electrodes as possible. And ironically, very often, in the end, we record the result of a single electrode. In the real world recordings, we need to be smarter. If we want to record in everyday life with as little interference with a person's normal behavior, we are bound to have a limited number of sensors. We should place only the sensors that are necessary. And for this, we need to know where to place the sensors optimally for the brain signals we are interested in. And we have to know the limits of our system. What can we and cannot we expect to record with a given sensor configuration? For the secret, for example, we have used a forward modeling approach, simulation to estimate to which part of the cortex we are sensitive with ear EEG compared to a full cap. And in this plot here, you see in dark blue those areas where we are equally sensitive to the signal, both with cap EEG and with ear EEG. And the yellow and red areas even indicate areas where we might be more sensitive to brain activity with the EEG compared to cap EEG. So before we start to record in the wild, we should know whether the equipment we brought is actually capable of. Hence, when you now grab your mobile EEG to record in everyday life and throw your old clunky lab setup out of the windows, do not throw out everything we have learned from lab-based research. We can rely on decades of research. So I'm going on an adventure, but I will bring a map. And he actually has one, which I find nice. So to conclude, transparent EEG, ubiquitous EEG if used correctly, can be the neurophysiological equivalent of a dash cam, an EEG device that can capture brain activity for a long time and, by doing so, capturing events and temporal dynamics that we could never encounter in the lab. Instead of studying weird subjects that are doing exactly what we tell them to do, while only seeing and hearing what we allow them to see and hear, we can use ubiquitous EEG to record diverse people in diverse situations and thereby sample from the whole of human experience. And by this, it can open up an entirely new field of neuroscience. Thank you very much. In time.
Thank you very much, Martin. That's perfect on time. Super. I think this is like a really thrilling future prospect for EEG research in the real world. So thank you very much for that. I'm pretty sure we will have like tons of questions regarding this. And with that, I'm happy to announce our last speaker for today, and this is Ranjana Mehta, who's going to talk about human exoskeleton interactions, a mind-motor-machine investigation. Please, Ranjana, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Klaus, and thank you so much for the invitation. I feel like an oddball here, no pun intended, because I'm not a cognitive neuroscientist or a psychologist. I'm an engineer by training and also an ergonomist by training. So neuroergonomics is, I think, is relatively new for me. But what I want to provide here is an insight on how neuroergonomics can really help in understanding, measuring, and modeling mind-motor-machine investigations, particularly as we are going into human technology partnerships across aspects of our lives. So my lab looks at understanding, assessing, and augmenting human technology interactions in high-risk environments. And in doing so, we look at the mind through neuroergonomic applications. Motor aspects are something that my PhD was in, and its interaction with different machines. While doing so, we take an integrative approach. We look into the mind as well as in the brain. I've been told they are two different things, and I completely agree. We also look at autonomic and peripheral responses as it relates to physiology, particularly for motor fatigue, and movement kinematics, because now if you take your lab out in the field, you need to figure out ways in which human behavior can be captured both through motor aspects, but also through mind aspects. When I started my PhD work, now it's a long time back, I was interested in understanding the interplay between physical and cognitive work. What I found in the literature was that there was a lot of, there was extensive research that looked at the effects of physical activity, physical capacity on cognitive performance. However, the reverse was not very well studied. So for example, the implications of cognitive risk factors on musculoskeletal injuries, there were evidences of those, but those evidence lacked, systematic research investigations, particularly into the mechanisms. More importantly, for ergonomists, when you look at the tools that ergonomists use, they use simple checklists like the ruler REBA, or we could do, 3D SSPP, spine, musculoskeletal modeling. And now we have variables in the field that look at, based on how much a person is lifting, from where they are lifting, how frequently they're lifting, what's the load. We can create musculoskeletal risk indices, but we do not incorporate the cognitive factors. And that's a big gap because it's important in every aspect of work in life. We don't just do physical work. We do physical and cognitive work. They work in tandem over here, and it is the lack of research and translating practice in the field of ergonomics that made me look into those directions. And it's even more pertinent right now. It's not just the human mind and motor systems that are working together, but it's the human mind and motor systems working with different technologies in mind across a lot of different applications, be it an Amazon warehouse or collaborative robots in automotive industries or in collaborative robots in emergency response. So these technology aids can be at various spectrums of human interactions, right? They could be remote or teleoperated. where we have surgical robotics, or we have drones for disaster response. We also have collaborative robots in manufacturing industries, where we have these robots who are working side by side and sharing physical space with the workers. And then we are moving into more wearable robots, where we have exoskeletons that are passive and active in nature, that you don on, and that's helping you augment your work or helping reduce risk of musculoskeletal injuries. Across these spectrums of technological aids and their interactions with humans, we need to understand how different aspects of human cognition and motor responses get impacted. So for example, what is human performance in these domains? Is it just the human aspect of performance, or is it task performance? That's that's a component of both human and the technology. Looking at how do we use these technological aids that augment our cognitive capabilities under limited capacity. So think of a worker who has been working for 12 hours straight during this pandemic. Warehouse workers have been one of these essential workers that have been helping us stay connected and fulfilling our needs. They are working under limited capacity. They're getting physically fatigued. And we know that physical fatigue can induce cognitive impairment. So how would these technological aids help us understand and potentially improve our cognition? How would these technological aids reduce their own emerging risks or burdens? With every new technology, there are emerging risks. But what we don't want is any intervention creating a new set of risks or hazards. So how do we minimize that in the design of that technology? How do we enhance fluency or the interaction between the human and the technology? And that could be a lot of different ways. It could just be simple communication on when one stops working and one starts working, or it could be how in tandem both of them are working, and there is sort of like this fluency index where you understand that one of them is a little bit more hesitant, so the other one adjusts to it. And then finally, how this human technology interactions can be facilitated through effective learning and training. So for this particular talk, I want to talk about human exoskeleton interaction. The reason I chose this is because this is a really clear example of mind-motor machine interaction. And exoskeletons have, like the standing desks boom, they are now booming in industrial domains. They have shown strong potential to mitigate motor fatigue by reducing or transferring biomechanical loads from the regions of the body that exoskeleton is designed for. The global market for industrial exoskeleton is going to be crossing 5 billion by 2027. So it's a big market, and there is an accelerated pace of adoption of passive industrial exoskeletons in automotive industries across the country and across the globe. So for example, there are full automotive factories here that workers are being equipped with these exoskeletons. However, the implications of short-term and long-term use of the exoskeletons is still currently being researched. So there lies the challenge, is how do we ensure that this technological aid is not only effective, but also not harmful for us in the long term. So when we look at the evaluations for exoskeletons, we could think of a lot of different ways. The primary way for evaluating exoskeletons have been the physical fit. So how, whether the exoskeletons reduce loads on individual. And so there have been several studies in the last 3 to 4 years that have documented these evaluations, the physical fit evaluations. We have found that exoskeletons have positively reduced spine compressive forces. They have reduced energy expenditure for the same task that someone would do without an exoskeleton. However, there have also been studies that show that you wear an exoskeleton for your shoulder. Yes, it will reduce shoulder loads, but it is going somewhere. And where does it go? It goes to your spine. And so it can create emerging risks in your spine. There are other things that are currently being evaluated, like changes in lifting and movement kinematics with exoskeletons. So you can imagine the sort of motor adaptation that workers are doing as they are wearing these exoskeletons. There are studies on range of motion. There are beginning to be studies on long-term use of exoskeletons on proprioception as well. However, in terms of cognitive fit for exoskeletons, there are a handful of papers that are out there that look at how exoskeletons are cognitively adept or fluent with human users. So there have been some studies that have shown that when someone is wearing an exoskeleton versus not, if they're wearing an exoskeleton, there may be physical augmentation and benefits. However, users perceive greater workload for the same task. And on a dual task paradigm that have been utilized in some studies, they have shown that dual task performance decreases with an exoskeleton use compared to a no exoskeleton use. Much of the focus on this has been on usability. So how long does it take to don on an exoskeleton, don off an exoskeleton, how difficult it is to do that? What is the technology acceptance? Would users wear it on an everyday basis if it changes their reach and range of motion? However, what has not been really looked at and delineated is the mind-motor-machine interaction, which is what Klaus mentioned in one of the Cognitive Neuroergonomics grand challenges. How do you delineate the effect of a technology on this mind-motor interplay? But in doing so, there are some barriers. We don't have tools right now to document, human technology interactions across different, constructs like workload or adaptation. We need tools to evaluate this cognitive fit that do not alter the task itself. So for example, dual task paradigms change the task, right? So if I'm asking someone to lift and I'm asking someone to lift with a dual task, that's not the same task that a worker does in a shop floor. And finally, some of these tasks like the NASA TLX, you have to break the fluency or the flow of the worker to ask them these questions. And sometimes in some applications like trust, you may even prime them to the intent of the protocol, and you don't want to do that. And so there are some of these challenges. So what I suggest is, I think neuroergonomics is a great tool to sort of understand this human exoskeleton interaction. We can identify control systems in the brain that are recruited during human exoskeleton interaction. We can potentially quantify the cost of the fit of the exoskeleton. And maybe in the future, we can develop intelligently coupled human exoskeleton systems. That's not far away in the rehabilitation domain. People are already doing that with BCIs. But in the industrial domain, this is a bit of a challenge. And based on, everything that, all of the speakers have talked about, the translation from the lab to the field, are creating barriers for us to recognize the potential for real-time, fluent human exoskeleton interaction. Then when you think of an exoskeleton, you think of motor tasks, right? And so your neuroimaging technique needs to be adaptive to that. And like Ryan said, you don't need to be perfect, you need to be good, right? I need to realize the challenges associated with the different imaging techniques that you have there. For me, for the work that we are doing, we wanted the neuroimaging technique to be non-invasive. It had to be low cost. It had to be transportable. It had to be movement friendly, but it also had to provide mechanisms of pathways of the construct that we are trying to understand. And it had to be compatible with other modalities that we could do. We primarily use functional near-infrared spectroscopy, but the information that I'm providing here on, I'm pretty sure it can be translated to other neuroimaging techniques. So this is what we did as one of our first studies, almost a year and a half back, with Ohio State Spine Research Institute. We got people in the lab. We equipped them with, the motion capture system. We had force plates to document biomechanical performance parameters of spine. We used an EMG-assisted spine modeling method that Dr. Bill Maris had created to come up with spine compression and shear forces at the L5-S1 spine vertebrae. On the neurocognitive side, we used FNIRS, and we collected data from the SMA, premotor cortex, and the prefrontal cortex. Very quickly, the ergonomics impact of HEI. So when you look at what ergonomists are interested in, they would want to know the spine compression and shear forces. What we found was that using an exoskeleton versus not using an exoskeleton, did not really result in changes in compression forces, which is fine, which means that maybe there isn't a benefit for the exoskeleton with the compression force, but at least there is no risk. In terms of shear forces, we did see a benefit of the exoskeleton. However, it was marginal. When we think about practical significance of that, it wasn't substantially better with an exoskeleton. What we did with the neural data is there are a lot of challenges, right? So yes, somebody is lifting continuously for 30 minutes at specific pace. There is a lot of passive perfusion of blood flow. So we had to figure all of that out using short separation probe, a lot of motion artifact. We had to collect data on a lot of people. But what we found was that at first we wanted to just look at what regions of the brain are connected together, right? That's the first thing that we wanted to look at. Is it different? Is the blueprint of the brain during this task look different when a person is purely lifting a physical task, doing a physical job, versus doing that job with an exoskeleton? So we wanted to look at functional connectivity. We also wanted to get towards graph theoretic, metrics to look at, effective connectivity or provide some causality to these connections. And ultimately, we want to document the cost of adaptation. However, I have not reached there yet with our work so far. Very quickly, what we found with just pure functional connectivity across different brain regions, we found that compared to a control condition, when someone is lifting without an exo versus someone is lifting with an exo, we found there were increased connectivity strengths between the PFC and the SMA, PFC and the PMC, and the SMA and the PMC for the same physical task. Note that here, every participant was given training on the job, on the lifting job before the two conditions even started. We made sure we had a gender balanced pool. However, that's another concern, is that exoskeletons are designed for men mostly. So we had to get women who were, more than 50th percentile to fit the exoskeleton. So there were all of these challenges. These connections, we hypothesize are required for added postural stabilization and motor planning. And what we found was that, there were these additional regions that were being connected or working with each other to do the same task. And so to us, this is the cost, or this is the added burden of using an exoskeleton upfront. Why is it important to look at these connections? Is because the frontal lobe, in several industrial safety research, the PFC is considered as a process safety center of the brain. And it's, associated with decreased alert, is associated with alertness, concentration, decision-making. And if that region is engaged with the motor regions, when someone is wearing an exoskeleton versus not, that means that, those extra resources are now being utilized, and the person may be more vulnerable to any safety risks, although nothing of this has been quantified yet. So that is what we want to do. I will quickly talk about this. I don't want to, put a lot of thought here, but we did some effective connectivity analysis, and we tried to figure out what's the difference between when someone is lifting early versus late, what are the motor adaptations that are happening over time. And we did find that there were motor adaptations, and brain connectivity measures using Granger causality was helping us sort of understand that a bit better. We are not there yet in completely understanding it yet. Now, I want to conclude by providing some contributions of neuroergonomics to human exoskeleton interaction. These may be opportunities, or these may be challenges. The opportunity is that across different exoskeletons that are out there, maybe neuroergonomic evaluations can help in sort of saying where, human exoskeleton interaction quality lies for each of these models. However, the industry wants a number. They want us to give a number. They want us to say from 0 to 1, rank exoskeleton models. And I'm not sure we are there yet, but it's an opportunity for sure. The other is we want to look at establishing the cost of performance augmentation across discrete physical cognitive tasks. So we are doing studies in the lab where we are getting people for 3 to 4 days straight back to back. They are in the lab for 4 or 5 hours. And we are making them do physically demanding tasks with exoskeletons, another group without exoskeletons, and we are sort of learning how they're adapting over time. And we're collecting brain data as they are. Here we are looking at, when they're purely doing a physical task, like a reach and point, versus when they're doing a physical task with a cognitive task. We are also interested in knowing whether that's different from a tightly coupled physical cognitive task. So the trail making test, I think most of us are familiar with it. We created that in front of us, where we ensured that all the rigor for the trail making is presented in a whiteboard in front of them. And we are asking them to do a visual search task. So here they are physically moving, but also they're cognitively making decisions. This is a tightly coupled physical cognitive task. And we want to know how neural indices would change or be similar. And we want to look at how they are now versus 3 days later. And finally, we want to look at tasks that are, we want to look at neuroergonomics across more variable tasks. This is an unstructured task. Everyone lifts a patient differently. And so how do we even provide a number to human exoskeleton interaction quality for such tasks? So these are all very open questions right now, and in unstructured settings. So we are looking at the use of exoskeletons in emergency response. And we are looking at what are some of the sensory motor training needs, as well as the operational training needs. So we are developing a training platform for first responders to use these augmentation technologies and figuring out how we can train them in the use of these technologies. So I'll end with saying, there are even more opportunities here. I'm involved with the ASTM standards on human factors that focuses on exoskeleton. If you look at the various standards that we are currently working on, where I come in is system usefulness and usability. And we are heavily pushing for saying we need one for cognitive fit that's separate from usability. So hopefully we'll see that. Education and awareness around among ergonomists is a big issue. Telling an ergonomist that looking into the brain can give you more information has been a challenge for the last 10 years. They are receptive to it, but we need to talk their language. And so how do we get to that? I'm interested in understanding brain networks, but an industry person is interested in giving a number. So I'm going to stop here, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mariana. So this was a great panel, actually. I love the diversity of the topics and still having all some common points regarding the challenges that we identified also for the coming decades. We do now have a discussion round concerning all 4 presentations. And I would like to basically open up the space for questions first for the audience. And I think, so Luis, you might help me a little bit. There was one question by Gang Li for Martin. And I can read this out. I just have to find it again in the chat here. So give me a second. So Gang Li asked for Martin. Hi. I'm just wondering, what is the limitation of ear EEG? To what extent it can be comparable to a standard scalp EEG? And Graham Moffat writes on YouTube that it's just a difference in montage. So you're limited to the components that can be measured around the ear. Auditory components are particularly strong just above the ear. The electrodes, there are quite close to the Herschel gyrus. And some compliments on the classification of natural office sounds. So Martin.
Yeah, of course, ear EEG is just a kind of EEG, so nothing fancy there. Also, ear EEG basically uses the disadvantage of EEG, namely that it's spatially completely unspecific. So you measure everything all over the brain. So with ear EEG, yes, it's right that we are most sensitive to areas around the temporal cortex. But because of the orientation of different sources and how the signal spreads over the entire scalp, we are not only sensitive to these regions. So we know that we can also record P300, for example, which is a widespread phenomenon, alpha activity, or coming from the back of the head very likely. So when you close your eyes, you see a strong alpha component. We know that we can use it for detecting different sleep stages. So it's a very broad set of different task and not limited only to the areas it's close to, but it always depends on the orientation of the source. And in this MISA paper from 2020, we discuss all these different influences.
Yes, thank you. So I don't see any further questions from the audience at the moment, so I would give it up to the panel. Do you guys have questions regarding the different presentations? And maybe if I might start. I think I already hinted at the transition between Carol and Martin, basically. So Carol, the question would go to you. We've been working with captains on ships, with like professional truck drivers, and there's a really strong resistance towards putting an EEG cap on during your work time. So would you see EEG, and what kind of development would you see EEG to really be an instrument, a method to get to user state in the future?
If I'm understanding the question, I think we need a system very similar to what Martin was describing, something that is not very intrusive, something you can almost forget you're wearing. So yeah, I mean, I think that potentially has a lot of promise, and Martin, I want to learn more about where you guys are currently at with that. But I know I have a number of applications coming up too, where I'm currently questioning. They're not all in the driving realm. One's in a VR setting, and people are going to be already wearing a VR cap. So I'm going, well, what kind of system can I even use then? There's going to be the interference between, can they wear two caps, and how uncomfortable would that be? I mean, maybe this in-ear system would be ideal. I know sometimes in the past I went away from the caps because I agree something Martin said about you don't necessarily need dense electrode arrays if you're only going to be looking at a couple of things. So sometimes we've literally used single electrodes, so you don't have to wear the whole cap. They're easier to wear, easier to clean up after. Yeah, anyway, hope that kind of answers your question, but
yeah.
Yeah.
I would perfectly agree. So, and maybe for Martin, just following up on that, I really like the idea of you're extracting the auditory information from the environment. I think that is a significant step towards important context information. So what happens, so that we get like ideas how to analyze EEG. But wouldn't you think that visual information like goggles, eye tracking, scene cameras, something like that in that direction, do you see that to be more prominent, more important to extract what's going on?
Well, it all depends on the use case you have. Also, to Carol quickly, so I would always place as many electrodes as I can get away with. So if I have a headset anyways, I would use additional sensors. So ear EEG is really the extreme case when you really have to have it maximally mobile and transparent, then use it. If you have the possibility to go with a full cap, use the full cap. You have always more information. So it's always a limitation of information we have there. So that is what I said, know the limitations of your system. You can use ear EEG for some purposes when you really have to be mobile, but it's not a replacement for a 265 high density EEG cap. So don't get me wrong there. The second idea, yes, of course, or what Klaus just said, of course, if you have visual information, eye tracking and record stuff, then this would be very helpful. However, that's going to be tricky in real world. As soon as you have an eye tracker on, which monitors the world, you again are not very flexible. It's going to be a backpack where you put in all the hardware for that. So yes, this information is useful, but I think not for the kind of use case we have in mind. And their auditory information is easy to get. Especially in Germany or in Europe, we have a strong digital rights, what's the term, technical term, DSGVO. So we are not allowed to do recordings in public spaces, neither auditory or visual. So with the app we build now, we record audio, but we dissect it directly into features. So we only record features and not the full speech, because we are not allowed to record what people would say on the street and so on. So we are limited by legal and ethical considerations of what we can do. The question, what would be cool to have and nice, I think is a different one.
Yeah, I agree on that one. But so I would rather see like smart glasses, like Google glasses, for example, for the future. So nothing like hardware intensive, no large requirements regarding like what you have to carry around. So that was something I was thinking along. The question then is, obviously, can you do online near real-time labeling of visual events, for example? Maybe a question that goes into the direction of Ryan, to extract relevant information, because we're talking about like all the different setups that we saw from Carol's driving to Martin's real world to Ranjana's exoskeleton interactions. So all these huge differences in the experimental protocols. How do you see a way to extract identical cognitive processes to model, to get all together into modeling approaches? This goes to Ryan.
Yeah, and of course, as you were asking that question, my wife was asking me questions. But I think I get I follow. So I think it comes down to creating markers or classifiers that are associated with core cognitive processes. It all comes back to generalizability. In the end, your memory is always going to be playing a role in any task we do. How I organize and filter information via attention, what information I can extract from the world. This was one of the reasons why we were driven to look at memory, attention, and perception. Because we felt they're going to be involved in everything you do, but with different degrees. And there are obviously others that we need to look at, so for different constructs, moving away from kind of like this paradigm of cognitive loading, but then maybe to elements of situation awareness and projection, or how the brain handles robustness beyond kind of what is through cognitive load. I think we can consider different things. And it's also kind of like why we were focused on prefrontal cortex. I think Ranjana had a great figure that just shows it is involved in everything. It contributes to so much. That's not to say that's the only place we should look, but it's a nice place to kind of capture some of these core cognitive principles. And it goes back to kind of what I was saying about good versus perfect. There's so many different cognitive constructs we can look at. What we need to start with are just what are some core things that we can look for differences in across many, many contexts, and continue to build kind of things up. And I kind of want to follow up with there were things that Lewis asked a great question, and I kind of wanted to just add a little context there around risks and things of that nature. And they're very real. Whenever we build a tool that claims to do something as powerful as the things that we're claiming to do, which is essentially, read what's going on in the brain and make that potentially available to other systems or people, that's a very powerful thing. My perception at the moment, and it may change, is the bigger risk, though, is not getting these tools out there. As I think as long as we're responsible and are continuously aware of those risks, we're only going to really figure out what the real ones are when they get used. I mean, a great example, I think, is the work on facial recognition. It is incredibly powerful, it's incredibly useful, but until it was becoming widespread, no one fully understood the biases or the problems that some of those algorithms were going to have. It is that double-edged sword of, with greater use, we also gain a better understanding of the underlying tools and systems and how to balance them. And I think right now, what we really need as a field is to get them out there, get our tools out there, get them helping people, and then using that as a springboard to continue to enhance what we have. So that's kind of my current thinking.
Okay, thank you very much. Lewis, you raised your hand.
Oh, I mean, that was essentially the topic I wanted to bring up, which Ryan's just talked about. That's a fairly high-level topic, and I think it's actually quite a nice topic that we could actually take to the bar under normal circumstances, I feel more than obliged to invite Klaus to invite all of us to a round of drinks. But for today, I guess we could make do with the Discord server. Klaus, do you have anything to add to that?
No. I agree with Ryan on that. I think there was like an interesting comment from Elsa Kirchner on YouTube regarding Ranjana's talk and addressing Carol. I think actually she states that it is possible to measure task load based on the P300 without artificially adding a second task. I'd be more than curious as to learn how you do that. But I think or could imagine that it goes along the line like a blink-based activity or something that you extract from natural ongoing EEG and add like natural physiological markers. And that's something I was thinking along when Martin also presented, that while extracting environmental auditory information, you could also use simple eye movement related information on top of that, right? Trying to get like multidimensional data together if you have no other information. So that might be another way to go. But do you guys have questions regarding your talks? I don't want to take like all the time here.
I mean, I just want to, say there are some embedded type tests. I know people have gotten P300 from like brake lights coming on or probes, either visual or auditory, that you didn't have to respond to. But to go back to what was said before, I actually think that's another challenge currently of our situation. I think a lot of times we do work out potential solutions, at least to some of these challenges, in the bar when we can be, or wherever we can, over coffee, where we can get together and we can really say, like, not in a public forum, what's the most pressing, issue we're having or challenge we're having, and we can brainstorm that. And I know I've been missing that. I'm sure many of you guys have as well, that interaction. So I very much look forward to these kinds of things going live in the near future. I've missed it. And I think it's very helpful scientifically as well.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, if I could ask one more quick question, of the group is, I'm really interested in where everyone is going with their data limits and data sizes. There's constantly a push for more big data, and obviously it is a truism that you can never have enough data. A constant concern that I have in kind of having a lot of interaction with AI engineers and machine learning engineers is when there's a push for big data, there can sometimes be a commensurate loss of contextual control in the data. It is my experience that big data is not a substitute for context. And so I'd be interested to hear from anybody in how they're doing with their data sizes. And I can comment, one of our big pushes right now is understanding the tools we can use to operate in the lowest data limits possible so that we can have better context, so denser, almost the data is more dense than it is just big. And when I say low data limit, a lot of our experiments right now are with like 30,000 observations, looking at state spaces that are like 1 to the 20th power, and then only measuring, 1 to the negative 15th number of possible state spaces. So we're kind of exploring low data limits and low state space observations to then make highly predictive models. So I'm interested in what everyone else is thinking about in terms of their data sizes, data requirements, and the models they use that are then commensurate with those data. I think all of that goes hand in hand. I think we've gotten the scientific community overall has kind of gotten addicted to an exponential growth in computational power, such that we haven't had to think very deeply about the amount of data we're working with and then the tools we apply. It's just, well, I'll always have more data storage, I'll always have more data, and I'll always have more computational power. So I just think it's interesting. I'm interested in what others are thinking on this, and where us as a field, and fields in general might go regarding data computation and these kinds of things.
Okay, I would give this to the panel to respond.
So I could jump in very quickly here. I mean, clearly we're not going to solve this issue of data standardization, but and in the area of neuroscience, of course, there's been moves towards that with, for example, with BIDS and trying to draw, for example, mobile neuroimaging techniques closer to actual, anatomical imaging. Co-registrations, but I mean, it's certainly a worthwhile topic to start thinking about how operations could actually also be similarly standardized. So whilst we do have fairly robust and highly replicated experimental paradigms in the area of cognitive neuroscience, you would see that with every variation of a visual search array task or a Posner task, there will be some slight differences that does render one study different from the next. Right. So that may not necessarily be the best basis in order to achieve standardizations across different data sets. Now, one thing that's really intrigued me about human factors and the operational context is that such context actually comes with highly prescribed and very well-defined standards, be it DIN4, ISO. And I think it's certainly an open topic with regards to how we could achieve these level of standardizations, which, like Ranjana pointed out earlier in her talk. And of course, there's efforts by Ricardo Chavarriaga and colleagues in trying to achieve some level of standardization for neurotechnologies. So I mean, that's my perspective on it. But I think it's a very open challenge in terms of, can we actually be leveraging the existing standardizations that we find in work practices to provide some kind of consistent framework for the data in which we obtain within these contexts. Perhaps, Ryan, you'd like to organize a workshop at the Neuroeconomics conference. Think about it.
But by the way, quick question. So is it going to be a hybrid conference? Did you decide already, finally?
So it's currently definitely going to be a digital conference. Klaus, you're in Germany as I am, so you know the decisiveness of our current climate with regards to deciding whether or not to allow people to meet up. So we're hoping to definitely confirm everything by next month. Okay. Yeah, I'm still trying to go for a hybrid conference at the moment, but it certainly looks like it will definitely be a digital conference, which is also why it's not possible to register yet, because we've not been able to get that confirmation.
Thank you. Ranjana?
I just want to add to what Ryan mentioned. I think the challenges that you're talking about is very domain specific, right? So in the physical ergonomics domain, we can't have 500 trials in one experiment. It's almost impossible to do that. Getting someone to lift maybe 50 to 60 times before they even change their states, the fatigue states or the central fatigue, cognitive fatigue states. So I think we have an opposite problem, which is we have for AI to work, we don't have sufficient data, and our block experimentation is different. The way we would consider a 30-second trial would have 5 or 6 lifts in it, but that's too repetitive. So there are these challenges that I think need to also be discussed a bit more in the neuroergonomics domain. The challenges specifically with motor tasks, and then we don't have standards or best practices in that. So we always get these questions from reviewers who are looking at things from the cognitive side and cognitive experimentation and protocol side, and it's really challenging to speak that language and bridge the gaps.
I'm muted, but I entirely agree. And maybe I can add to Ryan also, when you ask about the different views in our lab, for example, we have a wide range, and the data we acquire really depends on the question that we ask. So in that sense, I entirely agree with Martin. So if you can use a cab, if we are in the lab, if we have like the VR setting with a backpack, then we use like 164 channels plus the VR, and we try to get motion capture on top of that to have like all the data that we need to ask very basic questions. But if I'm really interested only in like whether there's higher load in a specific navigation instruction condition in the real world, then I don't care about all the other things as long as I can get down to the parameters I'm interested in and define a priori. So there's a wide range, and I think that's also converging with Panjana's approach in these different modalities that we're looking at. So I think the question, or the important question, is can we develop tools that would extract similar tasks in all these different settings? So it's just that like the underlying basic cognitive processes that we address, can we extract those from all these different protocols, from different scenarios, to then converge across basic research to apply to real world research, to extract these fundamentals and get like conversions in the results with regards to that. That would be my question. How can we achieve that? Jana, are you still raising a hand, or is that the old hand? The old hand.
But I can add. I think the question is, should we do that, right? I think we need to answer that question. And I have been struggling in this physical neuroergonomics, cognitive neuroergonomics domain, trying to talk to ergonomists on the importance of neuroergonomics. I don't know whether we should first try to get everything together. I think what we need to do is talk to the relevant people who create standards for a particular application space and talk to them about what their needs are. Because it's highly likely that even if we do get to a place where, Klaus, you are envisioning, it may not be acceptable to individual standards group for particular applications. So I think the key is to talk to the stakeholders who create these standards for their work and see how we can work with them to include neuroergonomics. And I'm hoping that's what we do, because one of the questions I got asked at the ASTM standards is there a specific task that you can do? Can you borrow from the task that we created? And so, if I say no, I need to take this task in my standard task, they may not adopt that tool at that point, because they've already created standards based on standardized tasks that fits for 90% of their measures.
Yeah.
It's challenging.
I agree. Okay. Are there any more comments or specific questions to any of the presentations we had? If not, I think this is. I would really love to see you all in person, and hopefully next year this will be definitely the case at one of the conferences. So I hope to meet you there in person again. We're longing to that, having a glass of wine in my hand and talk to you directly. So thank you again. Thank you very much for joining us and presenting, I think, a really great insight into the journal section, the diversity of the topics that we have, the importance of modeling, real-world application, transition from basic to applied research, the methods how to do that, and not only focusing on the neuroscience of cognitive processes, but the interaction of the human physical structure in interaction with cognition. So all that, which is highly relevant for our section, I hope we provided the audience insight of what is going on. So thank you very much for presenting. Thank you for joining us and listening to our talks. And Louis, again, thank you very much for organizing this. So if you want to conclude with some final words,
well, just to thank everyone and you as well, Klaus. So big round of applause for us. And of course the audience. So I'm just going to be hanging out on the Discord server. So if anyone's listening and like to hang out, and happy to answer your questions on the conference there. So take care, stay safe, and stay healthy, everyone. See you around. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.